The next morning, Emma walked into the cafe half expecting a pink slip waiting for her. She had replayed yesterday's confrontation in her head over and over during the night, the way Alexander's voice had dripped with contempt, the way she'd stepped in without thinking, and the heavy silence that followed. People didn't stand up to the CEO and keep their jobs. Not here. Yet, as she tied her apron and started the espresso machine, there was no sign of trouble. No HR email. No stern visit from a manager. Just another busy morning, until 9 a.m. sharp, when Alexander Kane walked through the lobby doors. But this time, he didn't storm in. He walked at a normal pace, no phone pressed to his ear, no thundercloud on his face. The usual ripple of tension still moved through the lobby, but he seemed different. He approached the counter, and Emma braced herself for a cutting remark. Instead, he said, "Morning," his tone neutral. "Morning," she replied cautiously. "Black coffee. Extra hot." "2 sugars," he said, but there was no bite to his voice. She nodded and rang him up. "Coming right up." While she prepped his order, she caught him glancing around the cafe, not with disdain, but with something almost curious. When she handed him the cup, expecting him to turn and leave, he surprised her by pausing. "How's business this morning?" he asked. Emma looked at him, trying to read his expression. "Steady. A few regulars, a couple of new faces." He gave a short nod. "Good." And with that, he left. It wasn't much, but compared to his usual behavior, it felt almost polite. Over the next week, he began appearing more often. Sometimes twice a day. And with each visit, his edges seemed to soften. On Tuesday, he asked Emma how long she'd been working there. 2 weeks, she said. "Feels longer," he replied. "You run this place like you've been here for years." On Thursday, he waited in line behind 2 customers without complaint. A sight so shocking that one of the regulars nearly spilled her latte. By Friday, the change was undeniable. Alexander held the door open for a junior analyst carrying a stack of binders, murmuring, "Careful with those." A few employees exchanged bewildered glances. The man they called the ICE CEO was thawing, and everyone knew it started the day Emma stood up to him. One afternoon, when the lunch rush had slowed, Alexander lingered at the counter instead of leaving with his coffee. "You ever work in an office before?" he asked. Emma shook her head. "Nope. Just cafes, bakeries, restaurants. I like people, and I like serving them. Most of the time." "Most of the time," he repeated, a corner of his mouth twitching. "I imagine you've had your fair share of rude customers." "A few," she said, arching an eyebrow. "Some worse than others." His eyes flickered, just enough to show he caught the hint. "I suppose I might have been one of them." Emma didn't reply right away. She kept her focus on wiping down the counter, letting the silence do the work. Finally, she said, "I think everyone has bad days. The difference is how you treat people anyway." He didn't argue. In fact, he seemed to consider her words, his gaze distant for a moment before he gave a single nod. By the end of the month, the cafe staff no longer froze when Alexander approached. They still worked quickly, but not out of fear, out of habit. And Alexander, for reasons he didn't quite understand himself, found he actually liked the sound of casual chatter around him, the smell of fresh coffee, the way Emma never treated him like a king or a monster, just a man ordering a drink. Little did Emma know, the CEO she'd challenged in front of the entire cafe was about to share something with her he'd never told anyone in this building. The next time he walked in, it wouldn't be just for coffee. It was a quiet Wednesday evening, the kind where the office lights upstairs dimmed early and the lobby echoed with the occasional click of high heels or the low hum of the cleaning crew's vacuum. Emma was restocking the pastry case when she noticed Alexander Kane standing by the cafe counter, no phone, no coffee in hand, just waiting. "Late coffee run?" she asked, slipping a tray into place. "Not exactly," he said. Mind if I sit for a minute? Emma glanced toward the empty seating area. Sure. He took a seat at one of the small corner tables, his suit jacket unbuttoned, his posture less rigid than usual. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then he leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. You probably think I'm just another arrogant CEO who likes to throw his weight around, he began. Emma arched an eyebrow. That's one interpretation. A faint smile touched his lips, but it didn't last long. The truth is, I didn't always have this. The company. The money. The title. His voice was steady, but there was a heaviness to it. I grew up in a neighborhood where no one had much of anything. My dad left early on, my mom worked 2 jobs, and people looked at us like we were less. I got used to being talked down to, pushed aside. Emma listened quietly, her hands folded on the table. When I started building my business, I told myself I'd never be in that position again, he continued. But somewhere along the way, I started doing the same thing to others that was done to me. Barking orders. Cutting people down before they could cut me down. I told myself it was about efficiency, control. But really, he exhaled. It was fear. Emma tilted her head. Fear of what? That if I ever let my guard down, I'd be right back where I started. The admission hung in the air for a moment, raw and unpolished. Emma's voice was soft but firm. Kindness doesn't make you weak, Alexander. It makes you strong enough to not need fear as a shield. He studied her for a long moment, the corner of his mouth lifting slightly. You know, no one's ever said that to me. Not in this building. Not in my life, really. That's because no one wants to risk getting fired, she said with a small smile. His eyes softened. You didn't think about that when you stood up to me, did you? Not for a second. 2 weeks later, the change became impossible to ignore. Alexander's tone in meetings was calmer. He listened more. He'd even been spotted helping an intern carry boxes to the mailroom. But the biggest shock came during the quarterly all-staff meeting. The auditorium was packed, employees murmuring quietly as the CEO took the stage. Emma hadn't planned to attend, she was working the cafe, but one of her co-workers insisted she come upstairs, just for a minute. Alexander began his usual presentation, growth numbers, projections, upcoming projects. Then, unexpectedly, he paused. Before we wrap up, I want to talk about something more important than profit margins, he said, scanning the room. I've been called a lot of things in my career, driven, ambitious, relentless. But I've also been called something else. Difficult. Intimidating. Unapproachable. And those things were true. A ripple of surprise moved through the crowd. A few weeks ago, someone here reminded me that respect isn't earned by fear. It's earned by how you treat people. That person is Emma Clark, from the cafe downstairs. Emma felt her stomach drop as every head in the room turned toward her. She stood up to me when no one else would. And she was right to, Alexander continued. Her courage reminded me of something I'd forgotten, that kindness is power, too. So from this day forward, I'm committed to leading this company with the same respect I expect from others. Applause began slowly, then swelled until it filled the room. Emma sat frozen, cheeks warm, unsure whether to shrink into her seat or stand. When the meeting ended, Alexander approached her in the aisle. I meant every word, he said quietly. I know, she replied. And for the first time since she'd met him, Alexander Kane smiled without any trace of armor. The fear that had once hung over the office began to fade in the weeks that followed. People laughed more in the halls. The cafe felt lighter, warmer. And while Alexander was still the sharpest mind in the building, he was no longer the coldest. All because one cashier decided that even the most powerful man in the room still needed to be reminded of something simple. Respect is a two-way street. The glass doors of Kane Global Enterprises opened with a whisper, letting in the early morning rush of employees. The lobby smelled faintly of roasted coffee and fresh polish, but it couldn't hide the tension in the air. People moved briskly, voices low, eyes darting toward the elevator as if waiting for something, or rather, someone. Emma Clark, the newest cashier at the company's lobby cafe, was still learning names and faces. She had started just a week ago, and though the job was simple, ringing up orders, greeting customers, keeping things tidy, she could feel the unspoken rules that existed here. There was an odd nervous energy that seemed to ripple through the building at random times, and this morning it was stronger than ever. At 8:45 a.m., she noticed it, the subtle shift. Conversations cut short, footsteps quickened, and a few people even straightened their jackets. It was as if someone had shouted, "Heads up," without actually saying a word. And then he walked in. Alexander Kane. Emma had never seen him in person, only on the glossy magazine covers displayed near the front desk. The articles called him the relentless visionary, the self-made tycoon, and the man who turned pennies into empires. But if the photographs made him look powerful, real life made him imposing. Tall, broad-shouldered, and sharply dressed in a charcoal suit, he moved through the lobby with the precision of someone who never had to wait for anything in his life. His expression was unreadable, or perhaps simply carved from stone. A quick flick of his eyes seemed to assess everyone in his path, and though he didn't speak, people instinctively stepped aside, giving him a clear route to the private elevator. Emma noticed how no one dared to meet his gaze for more than a second. One woman nearly dropped her phone in her rush to tuck it away before he passed. Leaning slightly over the cafe counter, her coworker whispered, "That's him, Mr. Kane. Don't talk to him unless he talks to you. And, whatever you do, don't mess up his coffee order." Emma raised an eyebrow. "Is he, really that bad?" Her coworker gave a tight smile. "Let's just say people have been reassigned over less." Emma glanced back at him as he strode across the marble floor, his polished shoes clicking with an almost rhythmic authority. She'd worked customer service jobs before, demanding clients, rude customers, people with too much money and too little patience, but something about the way the entire lobby seemed to shrink when he entered, it was unsettling. Still, she wasn't the type to scare easily. As she adjusted the cafe's register and prepared for the morning rush, she couldn't help but wonder why a man so admired by the business world seemed so feared by his own employees. And though she didn't know it yet, she was about to find out, firsthand. The following Tuesday morning started like any other. A steady stream of employees in tailored suits, ordering their usual double espressos and almond milk lattes before rushing to meetings. Emma moved efficiently behind the counter, sliding paper cups down the prep line, smiling at every customer, keeping the cafe running like a well-oiled machine. It was mid-morning when the lobby doors swung open with force, and a familiar figure cut through the crowd like a blade. Alexander Kane. But this time, there was no silent glide to the elevator. His stride was faster, sharper. His jaw was set tight, and there was a faint crease between his brows, the look of a man already irritated before his day had even begun. He didn't wait in line. "Black coffee. Extra hot. 2 sugars," he said abruptly, standing directly in front of the counter. Emma glanced up from the register, meeting his eyes for the first time. They were a piercing steel gray, the kind that could slice through excuses before they left your mouth. "Good morning," she replied evenly, her tone polite but not overly deferential. "It'll be just a few minutes." "Why?" he asked flatly. She blinked, momentarily thrown by the question. "Because there are 3 orders ahead of you, sir. We'll get yours ready as quickly as we can." He exhaled, not quite a sigh, more like the sound of patience thinning. "I don't wait. Not for coffee. Not for anything. Clear the board and make mine now." The cafe had gone noticeably quieter. The young barista at the espresso machine looked panicked, glancing between Emma and the CEO like a rabbit caught between 2 wolves. Emma could feel the weight of a dozen eyes from nearby tables. She kept her voice calm. "Sir, I understand you're in a hurry, but these customers were here first. We'll have your order ready in about 2 minutes." His lips pressed into a thin line. "Do you know who I am?" "I do," she said, matching his gaze without flinching. "And I also know the people in line have deadlines and meetings, too." For a fraction of a second, something flickered in his expression, surprise, maybe, but it was gone as quickly as it came. "Fine," he muttered, stepping back just enough to allow the next order to be prepared. The cafe slowly returned to its normal rhythm, though Emma could feel the lingering tension in the air. When his coffee was finally handed to him, she slid it across the counter and said, "Extra hot, 2 sugars, just like you asked." He took it without a word, but his eyes lingered on her for a beat longer than necessary before he turned and walked away. Her coworker leaned in, whispering, "I can't believe you said that to him. You have no idea how lucky you are he didn't explode." Emma simply smiled faintly. "I've dealt with worse." She didn't realize it yet, but this wouldn't be their last standoff. 3 days later, the storm arrived. It was a Friday morning, the cafe was buzzing, and Emma was already juggling a dozen orders when the glass doors opened and Alexander Kane strode in, faster than usual, his phone pressed to his ear, voice raised. "Then fix it, or I'll find someone who can," he barked into the receiver, his words echoing against the high ceilings. The employees in the lobby froze mid-step, eyes dropping to the floor. He ended the call abruptly, shoving the phone into his suit pocket, and beelined straight for the cafe counter. "Coffee. Now," he snapped, tossing a $5 bill onto the counter without making eye contact. Emma was in the middle of ringing up a young barista in training named Kyle, who looked like he might faint under the CEO's glare. "Be right with you, sir," she said, her tone even. But Alexander's gaze shifted to Kyle, narrowing. "Is this what you call service? Standing around like an idiot while people wait?" Kyle's face went pale. I'm sorry, Mr. Kane, I was." Before he could finish, Alexander cut in, his voice low but laced with venom. "Sorry doesn't make the coffee pour faster. Maybe you should find a job that doesn't require basic competence." The entire cafe went silent. Even the espresso machine's steady hiss seemed to pause. Emma felt heat rising in her chest. She'd seen entitled customers before, but there was something about the way Alexander was speaking to Kyle, the deliberate cruelty, the way it stripped the kid's dignity in front of everyone, that made her blood boil. She set down the cup she'd been holding and stepped forward, her voice firm. "That's enough." Alexander's head turned sharply toward her. "Excuse me." "You heard me," Emma said, meeting his gaze without flinching. "You can be frustrated. You can want your coffee quickly. But you don't get to talk to people like that. Not here." His eyebrows rose, as if no one had ever dared address him this way. "Do you have any idea?" "I do," she interrupted, her voice steady but carrying across the cafe. "I know you're the CEO. I know everyone here works under you. But position doesn't give you the right to disrespect people who are just doing their jobs." The tension was thick enough to taste. A few employees glanced up from their laptops, eyes wide. Kyle stood frozen, torn between gratitude and terror. For a long moment, Alexander simply stared at her, his jaw tight. The steel in his gray eyes didn't soften, but there was a flicker, confusion. Shock. That passed through them. Emma didn't back down. "If you have an issue with how we're serving you, you can speak to me directly and respectfully. Otherwise, you can take your business elsewhere." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Alexander's lips pressed together. He reached for his wallet, pulled out a 20, and set it on the counter without a word. "Black. Extra hot. 2 sugars." Emma nodded. "Coming right up." As she turned to prepare the drink, she could feel his gaze on her. The entire cafe seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for him to erupt. But he didn't. When she handed him the cup, he took it silently, gave her one last unreadable look, and walked out. Only when the doors closed behind him did the room exhale. Kyle mumbled a quiet, "Thank you," his voice shaky. Emma smiled faintly. "Don't thank me. Everyone deserves respect, especially at work." Her coworker leaned over and whispered, "I think you just made history." What none of them knew yet was that she had also planted a seed, one that would begin to change the most feared man in the building.